So today, Eve and I are going to discuss Stoicism and disability. And by that, we don't just mean the disabilities that you can see. And we don't necessarily always mean something that's permanent, because you can have a disability that is temporary, and people often think that as well. They think, oh, you must have been born with it and you must die with it. And that's what disability is. Now, we're looking at anything that kind of affects your day-to-day life in a way that is often seen as very challenging, right? Not necessarily negative, but certainly challenging. And we're not looking at just the person who's disabled, or how a disabled person should walk around, journey in Stoicism, but also how they can journey within the community, and the community within them, because that is the circles of concern, to take the self and to be able to see the self in all of humanity, and the humanity in the self. That's the entire point of taking the circles of care and bringing them in. Yes, it is in one sense self-centered, because there's no other perspective that you can take as a Stoic. You can only be you. But as soon as you take the next one in, so that you can see your parent, for example, their struggles, their challenges, their ease in yourself, then you can really understand from a rational point of view how they might react, what's reasonable for them, and so on and so forth. So the plan for the session, and I must thank Eve for this, because she really did help with the planning, is what are we going to cover? So the very interesting question for me, at least, is disabled Stoics. Now, a lot of people might say Epictetus, and they'll say Epictetus was a disabled Stoic, but there's actually more than Epictetus. This is quite a controversial next thing. Disability is preferred and dispreferred indifference. Everybody often, or most people, not everybody, most people assume that a disability is always a dispreferred indifferent. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about one of the favorite phrases of people: obstacle is the way. We've heard about it earlier in the discussion that wasn't in the recording. Is the obstacle always the way? We're going to talk about Zeno and the cart analogy, the idea that the dog is tied to the cart is fate. And what do you do when the cart a heavy cart takes you in a direction that you may not have wanted to go down? What do you do? Do you struggle, or do you go in that direction as well? Eve, particularly, because she is the expert on this, will talk about circle of concern, being cared for, self-care, and caring for others. That's not my expertise, so I will thank Eve in advance for doing that for me. And we will do a Socratic dialogue that will not be recorded, but it will be about how do we think about disability now. So I will put people on the spot, which is why it will not be recorded. And then we will do a quick fire discussion with Eve, because she has a lot of insight into this, these challenges, which I myself don't have. So we will go on to the next slide. So I've just said there were disabled Stoics. Epictetus, he has a limp. Cleanthes, he's a boxer. Seneca, he has respiratory lung problems, possibly tuberculosis. And Marcus Aurelius, because he was constantly ill. So I won't talk about him today, because others will go on a lot about the ancient Stoics, and that's part of it, but there's also the application in the 21st century. But Marcus Aurelius is another good example of someone who was chronically ill. Chronic illness is a disability for some people, depending how we term that word. So we know that Epictetus had this challenge. We know that he was a slave. He then was freed, but he was a slave, and that his master was also a slave, and a particularly cruel master, considering his position earlier on in his life. But he'd forgotten his earlier life and decided that he was going to take a different perspective, and it wasn't going to be a merciful one. So we know that the early Christian called Origen wrote that when still a slave, Epictetus was tortured by his master, who twisted his leg. Enduring the pain with complete composure, Epictetus warned Epictetus, that his leg would break. And when it did break, he said, "There, did I not tell you that it would break?" And from that time, Epictetus walked with a limp. Sorry for the spelling error. So that's one example. A lot of people might not know Cleanthes. He was the second leader of the Stoic school, the Stoa. So it was Zeno of Citium, and then Cleanthes was the second leader. He was a boxer. And in ancient Greece, they really did like to punch the face. Right, so they got, there was a favoritism towards punching the face. And, you know, obviously they didn't have the hospitals and the physios and things that we have today. So if you were boxing, it was, you know, basically knuckle punching. And you know, if you were on the floor, you're on the floor. And when you got up, you'd probably be in a daze and you would have had brain injury, no doubt. So I do think that that is another example of an injury. And we know from recent research that too many hits to the head, if you know anything about American football, does cause slow thinking, or certainly alters your thinking in a way that isn't particularly positive. So I think that's another example of a Stoic who had, unquestionably, in my personal opinion, a disability because of the belts that he had in the ring, or not in the ring, because there's no ring, in an area. Seneca was consistently ill. And he says himself that he had catarrh, he had short attacks of fever, he was chronically ill. One time he even considers, you know, ending it all, but then he thinks, oh, that would upset my father too much. So he's another character who had what many people would say or classify as a disability. Disability as an indifferent. Now, this is, I think, fundamental, because a lot of people, like I said, will automatically assume that it's preferred indifferent. So before I explain that, I will explain what indifferent is. So indifferent doesn't mean that you don't care, right? Stoics often get accused of, they think everything's an indifference, so they don't care. It just means, when I say indifferent, it means that it matters, but not enough to have an impact on your character. It can't force you to have a good character. It can't force you to have a bad character. So it's of secondary importance to the primary importance of aligning yourself with nature, living a virtuous life and avoiding vice. Vice being the polar opposites of the virtues. Courage, for example, is a virtue. So cowardice would be the vice. Justice, for example, is a virtue. So injustice would be the vice. Temperance is a virtue, or self-control. Greed would be the vice. Wisdom is the virtue. So ignorance would be the vice. So disability doesn't cause you to automatically be wise nor ignorant. Courage, to act with courage or act cowardly. That's not what makes the moral difference. And that's what they mean by it being an indifferent. It does not make the moral difference. That doesn't mean it's not important, and it doesn't mean that it's not hard or that it's easy. It just means that your life might not be pleasurable, but the Stoics never think that pleasure is what you really want in life. They say what you really want in life is to call a moral character that is incapable of making a moral error. So you can make an error, but not a moral one. So if a disability is always dispreferred, it would be a vice. If it's always bad, or, you know, in leaning that, it would be a vice. So there are times that a disability might be a preferred indifferent. And an example might be you're quite happy getting cheaper train travel. And at that moment, when everybody else is paying a little bit more money, you feel like, well, that's nice. That particular thing, that's great. I actually prefer that just for economic reasons in that particular scenario. You might feel that, as, for example, if you're deaf, that you love your community, that you enjoy the shared language. And that to you, it's a preferred thing because all your friends, or most of your friends, are deaf. Your closest friends may be deaf. And the thought of you becoming suddenly hearing would upset you, and it would challenge your identity. I know a lot of disabled people who see that as a fundamentally important component of identity. It doesn't mean that everybody does, but there are certain people that do. And so, like everything that's external, it's not that you're disabled or you're abled that makes the moral difference, but how you live your life. How you live it as a disabled person, how you care for yourself as a disabled person, how you react to other people. Some people trying really hard to be nice to you and it's not very helpful. And how you react to challenges and easier situations. Do you just put your feet up because someone's going to do all the work for you? That speaks to your character. Do you rise to a challenge? That speaks to you about your character. Do you automatically assume that everyone dislikes you because you're disabled? That speaks of your character, but it's not the disability per se that's going to stop you from flourishing. Because if it does, the Stoics are wrong. They say the only thing you need to flourish is a good character. Or as it would be, the only thing you need is a good character and a lack of a disability. And that's very Aristotle, because Aristotle said the only thing you need is a good character, to be a man, to be born in Athens, and to be educated. So you start to become Aristotelian in the way that you look at things. So is the obstacle the way? Now, Eve and I discussed this for quite some time, actually, in a couple of days. And I just felt with Eve that this was a very important thing to say. Sometimes, this is why it's sometimes the obstacle is the way. And sometimes it's just an obstacle, right? Wisdom, which is the virtue, is to know when is it an obstacle and when is it something that is the way. So when I have to go overcome an obstacle, or should I avoid an obstacle? It's not like I go around looking for every obstacle, because if I look for obstacles to hit, what I'm saying is that I need an obstacle to cultivate my character. And the Stoics would say, what you need to cultivate your character is to align yourself with nature, to face your opportunities, your circumstances, whatever they may be, and to work accordingly. Not to look for an obstacle in the belief that without that obstacle, somehow you're inadequate. Because the minute you do that, you're saying the same thing. You're saying, I need a challenge in life. If not, I can't do anything about my character. That's not the case. It doesn't mean they're not useful, but Stoics should try to find use in everything, because it's not something that becomes more useful than others. It's that how we deal with those circumstances, how we deal with our relationships with people, that's what talks about our character. So we don't need to think that every obstacle we ever face is the thing we should do. And if we don't have an obstacle, then that's terrible. So for example, you might say, it's terrible, I don't have to have a mortgage because my mum's giving me some money. I feel like such a bad person. Look at that. I don't have the obstacle of going to a mortgage lender. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to a mortgage lender anyway. I'm going to ask them for a mortgage, even though I don't need one. And you'll be like, why don't you use your time instead to help in the local soup kitchen? Wouldn't that be a better way to do things? Add an obstacle to your life of going to a mortgage lender. That would be an example. That's not particularly wise, useful. That's not really working for the cosmopolis. That's virtue signaling, actually, to say, oh, look at me, I'm struggling. And the minute you do that, it's not really Stoicism. And the Stoics would say that's mistaken logic, because again, you've believed that it's not that the only thing you need is a character that is completely aligned with nature, but you need something external to that character. So the dog tied to the cart, and people say to me all the time, but Kai, without challenges, I can't really become this wonderful person. And Masonius Rufus actually tells Pharazia, one of his students, empathizes with another of his students, he tells him off. He actually actively rebukes him. Because he says, oh, if I had a choice between exile and death, as a Roman, I would always pick death, right? Because of honor. And Masonius Rufus says, if nature gives you the easier burden of the two, why would you want something different? Why would you not accept what nature has given you? So if you haven't got a disability, it's not like you're going to say, I'm going to cut my foot off to give myself one. Say, okay, you haven't got one, so use your able body to work for the cosmopolis. That's what the Stoics say. It's not go and find out, go and cut your foot off or go cut your hand off to say, look at me, I've got a disability. So, I mean, that sounds crazy, but if you look at the exile and the death argument, he's like, no, I want to die because that's honorable. And he says, what is honorable is being content with what nature has given you, because nature is good. That's why virtue is the only good. So to want something that nature has not offered you is to struggle against the cart. And it was like a dog in a cart. So this is actually a picture from like 1909. I thought it was quite sweet, of a working dog. So you've got a cart, and I'm not saying the string or the rope that we have between us and the cart is the same. Some people have a really long piece of rope. They have much more flexibility than others. Some people are really tied to it and they have a very short ropes. They have very limited options. Some people's carts are really well oiled and slick, carbon fibers, and some is this creaky old thing. So I'm not saying that everybody has the same situation, but what I'm saying is to want something different to what's being given you is to drive yourself mad, because you're saying, oh, I wish that I didn't have this. Instead of saying, I have this, what can I do about it? So we can do two things. We can say this mountain is impossible to move. I shan't move it. And you can't. And if you don't reflect on, okay, why is it impossible? Why do I think that? And then say, is it? Can I get help with that? Can I ask somebody to come in and support me with that? At the same time, to assume that everything is possible. So to say, for example, to a disabled person, if you believe you can run in the Olympics. Well, I can't. Even if I believed I could run, I still wouldn't reach the Olympics. Even if I trained as hard as Usain Bolt, I'll never beat him. So there is reason will tell you, okay, where are my limitations? How much can I push them? Who can come alongside me to help me push them? What is a mountain that can't be moved? And what is a mountain that can? And that's Stoicism right there, to work out what can be done and what can't be done at this given moment. That doesn't mean in 10 years time when technology changes, it doesn't mean that suddenly you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a best friend who will help you do things you never could have done by yourself. That's not what I'm saying. But in the present moment, I just can't do it. It's not giving up. It's just being reasonable, going, okay, but what can I do? What can I do? And so okiosis is a very strong Stoic concept that the Stoics said, basically a child will have this need to preserve themselves. And you can see that because they'll cry. When they need something, they automatically will cry because they know that's the best way to get self-preservation, to preserve their physical integrity. And actually, the example that's given by Heracles, not many people know this, is that if children have the light turned off, they suddenly have an unfamiliar situation. So they will react, quite badly to that. And they will draw the attention of an adult, either who will relight the candle, basically, or would sleep next to them. So they feel some familiarity in the dark. Right? So once that external stimuli has gone, they feel like their existence is almost threatened. So they have this very sort of driven need to restore those boundaries that make them feel that they're okay, that they're safe. As we grow, as we mature, and the Stoics argue, actually, it's not a specific number, but between the age of 7 and 14, the logos, the divine reason, the essence of the universe, really gets developed in you. And people don't always realize this, but in the Stoic theology, the soul is physical. So when you actually act virtuously, what's happened is only the sage can be virtuous, and that's because they're basically the round peg in the round hole, and everybody else is like that square peg trying to get into the round hole. So everybody else can do what is appropriate or inappropriate, but they are or vicious, but they will never do what is virtuous until you're that round peg in that round hole where you fit perfectly, that it's like a glove. You just really are aligned with the universe. So we do have this need for self-preservation. Okay, so disabled people might feel that very acutely because there are certain limitations that one has, right? And it is perfectly natural to want to protect our physical and mental health, unless, and this is a very Stoic concept, unless it's to the detriment of our character. The minute that the protection of our physical integrity or our mental health is at the detriment to our character, that's when the Stoics draw the line and say it is better to die than to lose your character. This is what Cato, and that's a very controversial statement outside of Stoicism. But Cato's like, no, Julius Caesar, I will not give you permission to destroy my character, my integrity. I would rather die than do that. Right? People say, oh, that doesn't make any sense. But if you're a mother or a father and your child ventures out onto the road and a car comes, most parents will push their child out of their way, knowing full well that they're going to get hit by the car. It doesn't mean they know that they're going to die, but they know they're going to collide with that car. But for them, it's such a moral sort of instance that I have to protect my child at cost even to myself, because that is the right thing to do. So no one would say to a mother, you're a terrible human being because you pushed your kid out of the way and got injured as a result. Everybody, and I'm not a mother, so I can't say for sure, but I'm pretty much certain that every mother, blood relative or not even adopted mother, will push that child instinctively out of the way. They preserve that child, and that Stoics would say that's linked to okiosis. And that mother realizes that that child belongs to her. Right? So that the Stoics say, as we mature, we go from belonging to ourselves as a tiny infant to being a sort of kid. You can see it. They then want their group of friends at school, so they want to be part of the family. And as soon as they get to about 7, they're like, "No, mum, go away! I've got a party, got a Power Ranger party, and I'm going to be with my friends. You're boring." And that's the need for a child to belong to a bigger circle. And then they get to become teenagers, and they get to go, I've got social media and YouTubers, and they become a community of like 1 million people who follow a particular YouTuber. Again, the need to push away the smaller group just for a moment to realize they belong to a slightly larger. That doesn't mean they neglect their family. They don't. They push out and feel the need to bring more people in. Now, as an adult, we can do that in a rational manner. I'm not saying that teenagers always do, but we do that in a rational manner. And it doesn't need to be bilateral. So if, for example, you're a disabled person and someone treats you badly, they treat you badly, they look down on you, they ask your partner if you're okay, which is extremely annoying. They ask you if you would like help when it's obvious that you don't. But it's not because they're necessarily because they're being considerate, they're just not treating you in the way that you'd like. That doesn't mean that you can suddenly not care for them. That doesn't mean that you suddenly, as a disabled person, get to treat people with disdain because obviously they're bad people, quote unquote. So OKS is very strong. This sense of community that we have as rational beings can be extended to even those that don't recognize that they're in that community. And I want you, Eve, for you to give more information now about the practical applications of the theory that I've just given, if that's okay.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
So thank you, Kai. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Stoicism and being cared for, because I think I have quite an interesting life in that I care for people for a living, but also because I have multiple disabilities, I'm someone who's cared for as well. And the interesting thing about caring is that although it's something we might all aspire to say, I'm a caring person or I care for others, it can be something that could be very negative. It could be negative for the person doing the caring and the person who's cared for. If caring is done for disabled people and it's done without wisdom, then it could lead to people being very damaged who are doing the caring. They could end up burnt out and depleted, or the person who's being cared for could end up disenfranchised and disempowered, dependent on others. So it's very complicated. And I think the great thing about leaning into the virtues and remembering them and considering them, whether you're being cared for or you're providing care to others, is it does help you to be able to act with wisdom and to be more in alignment with your true nature and to be able to act with reason. So having a think about some of the virtues, for example, courage. I was just talking to Kai about the fact that during the pandemic, I ended up being a lot more dependent because I can't socially distance because I'm, very severely sight impaired. And recently I've started going out and about on my own again. And I was with someone who loves me dearly. And I went to cross the road and they kind of went to grab me and were like, there's a car coming. And it's really difficult, isn't it? Having the courage to not allow a blind person to walk out in front of a car, but to allow me to find my way. It's very difficult to do that, to allow someone who you care for to struggle at times or to take some risks in order to have agency in our lives. And actually that situation was more my fault than theirs. It was about the fact that I haven't made it clear enough what I'm capable of, because I think I had become quite dependent. And so then it becomes confusing for people, like what is an appropriate risk. So we might need the courage to step away from the person that we're caring for and allow them to fail sometimes, allow the disabled person to struggle. But another thing is we might need the courage when we're caring for people or being cared for, we might need the courage not to be embarrassed. So sometimes I've struggled too much, or I remember when I realized I couldn't run on my own anymore, it took me years to get over my embarrassment to ask someone to run with me, to ask for a sighted guide, to find a volunteer. But we might also need the courage to ask someone if they need help. I once literally walked smack into a lamppost when I was with some friends. And I actually, when I picked myself up, I said, for God's sake, I just walked straight into that lamppost. And they said, yeah, I saw that was going to happen, but I was too embarrassed to say anything. And I was like, no, honestly, they said I didn't want to be patronizing. And I was like, no, it's fine. It's fine. It's definitely worse nearly knocking yourself out. So courage all round, really. Courage to step back, courage to step up as well. With temperance, I think we all need that moderation. We need the self-awareness and the self-control, because when you think about it, part of our nature as humans, according to the Stoics, is that we are social creatures. And so we're actually going to have this drive to care for others. It's going to be in our nature. It comes from oikiosis, our drive to care for ourselves and then our offspring, and we learn to extend that to our community. And so we're going to want to care for others, and we're going to get a kind of natural good feeling from caring for others. But then that's going to mean that we might have a tendency to do it too much, or we might get comfortable being in the caring role. We might feel good about ourselves. And of course, the person who's being cared for is going to feel good as well, because they're all like, I'm being loved. This is all great. And it's insidious, isn't it? Because it can mean that if we don't keep paying careful attention, if we don't lean into wisdom, if we don't really pay attention to whether we're caring with moderation or being cared for with moderation, then we cannot realize that the person who's being cared for is losing their power and losing their agency. It happened to me a lot over the last year, and I just didn't see it because I work really hard. As people who know me know, I've got like 9 jobs, and I'm really focused on all the things I'm doing, and I didn't realize how much I was losing my independence. Because people were so kind to me and so helpful during the difficulties that I had during the pandemic. And I suddenly realized I'm double jabbed and I can be out on my own again, and yet I'm not. What's happened there? And that was just that, I don't know, lack of self-awareness, lack of moderation. I wasn't using temperance in how I was being cared for. And this is something I really, I would have thought I would have been more aware of it, but I think it sneaks up on us, which is why we need the self-awareness that the Stoics would say we need to develop. We need to be aware of what's going on. And then finally, with justice, when you think about it, unfortunately, caring could be neither kind nor fair. There's a thing in society, I think, I'm going to put a gender overlay on here. I reckon maybe more with women, perhaps, about the kind of, I gave up everything for my family. I've worked my fingers to the bone. I put everyone else first. I put myself last. I'm absolutely exhausted, but it's the right thing. I've given up everything for my children or whatever. And you get that happening with people who care for someone who's disabled, where they are giving up their whole life and they're completely burnt out and exhausted and damaged. And that isn't kind or fair to the person who's providing the caring. But of course, also, if the person who's being cared for, maybe out of love, is being given so much care that they aren't doing, when Kai was saying about trying to work out exactly what you can do, it's complicated, it's difficult, it's subtle, trying to work out what you can do. For many of us, myself included, what I can do, it's not a fixed point, is it? What I can do today might not be, depending on your disability, what you can do tomorrow. It might be different to last week. Maybe next year I can do more. Maybe I can do less. Maybe I'm having a bad day. So it's really complicated. And it's not kind or fair to have more care than is needed. So the whole situation is incredibly complicated. I don't get it right in the people I care for. I don't get it right as a person who is cared for. But I guess I try, and that's all you can do. And you try and have some self-awareness. You try and continue to check in. And I think being aware of the virtues gives you an amazing tool that can really help with this very tricky situation that we find ourselves in as people with disabilities, or as people who care for others who have disabilities. And then Kai, we've got the last slide. So this is what we've talked about today so far, that disabilities are an indifferent because they're not making the difference to whether you're living with good character. But they're not always dispreferred. I have a blue badge. Sometimes we get to park in really cool places, so that's good. Sometimes people get a free ticket to come somewhere with me. So I agree with you, Kai. Sometimes it's good. That, as Kai was saying, the obstacle isn't always the way. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I like this, why wish for the impossible or automatically assume something to be impossible. Trying to get that right is really tricky, isn't it? Trying to realize where the real limitations are for that day. It's all about character and how we deal with disability. And that is about how closely we're aligned with our true nature as rational, social human beings. And I like what you were saying about the care doesn't have to be bilateral. I found it really difficult. When I was a guide dog owner, I was on the receiving end of very aggressive and unkind behavior. And I saw at one point that I started to really not like people, just generally. I was afraid of people and I was viewing people with hostility. And it was, it was really bad. I had to really work on that and not meet aggression with aggression, and so yeah, I love what you said about that, Kai.
I was encouraged by what we were talking about with Stoic care, and I was reading 1974 book actually, Problems in Stoicism, edited by A.A. Long, and it was saying that ichthyosis, it isn't bilateral. You don't need to be cared for to care. I mean, somebody and that's interesting because that means, and that makes sense, because the sage, even if tortured, can still flourish. So the sage can never respond to dehumanize somebody, right? Even if he or she is dehumanized in the non-Stoic sense of the word, right? Because Stoics hit slightly differently. That doesn't give you the excuse to dehumanize, because then you don't see the reason, the logos in your fellow human being. You're actually not living according to nature. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that there's no punishment, because the Stoics do agree with punishment to correct. They do believe that if you're a danger to the cosmopolis, that there should be some things that are done to you, because you're so out of whack with what reason is, that there is something that should be done, that society should decide to do something. But that doesn't give you an excuse, because he or she treated me badly, therefore I'm going to treat you badly. Unless it's like he or she treated such and such a person badly and is actually a danger to the cosmopolis. And I can give you, an example in 1945 about an individual who was dangerous to the cosmopolis, and it was beyond treating an individual or a group of, a specific group of badly. It was beyond that. It was so gregarious that it was like, actually, this person, their very existence represents a danger to the cosmopolis. And the Stoics, that's when the Stoics would say, hang on a minute, there is a line. But if someone's treating me badly, like they're asking my partner if I'm okay instead of me, that doesn't mean that I necessarily go up to them, other than to say, look, if I did that to you, and explained it to them, right? But not to treat them badly just because they've treated me badly. At the same time, that doesn't mean I have to be overwhelmingly nice, right? So it doesn't mean like, oh, you can continue to treat me badly. That's perfectly reasonable. Let me be a doormat. That's not reason. It just says, do I have to spend time with that person? Perhaps it's reasonable to do something else.